Joining me now is the founder of the Convention of States Project, my very good friend, Mark Meckler. So, Mark, thanks so much for joining me.
It's really great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was explaining, in the introduction that the questions that I've heard and the questions that, frankly, I have is whether a convention of states is right for right now and the right time. Because what I saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, going to Republican state legislatures
Yep.
and seeing how spineless they were, how loath they were to actually fulfill their constitutional responsibilities. You and I have talked for years about how, this is great because Republicans control the majority of state legislatures. So, of course, the Convention of States is great. But I'm frankly a lot more skeptical of that proposition now. What say you?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think you're being too nice to the state legislatures. So, look, I live in those legislatures. I'm there during legislative season pretty much every week in multiple states. So yeah, it's honestly, it's bad there. It's no better, maybe a little bit better than it is in Washington, D.C. I would say I find more patriots in the state legislatures than I do in Congress. But it's not great. And that's because it's filled with human beings. And so here would be my response, which is I trust the founders and the framers, and they created a structure. They were under no misimpression that people were good. They understood that the nature of human beings was fundamentally flawed, that we're sinful, fallen creatures, and they designed a structure intended to deal with that. And so there's literally nothing that could change in the composition of the legislatures that would make me concerned about calling a convention of states because of the structure of the process.
So even if there were a majority of, let's say, Democrat-led state legislatures, you would still be as ardent an advocate for the Convention of States as you are now.
Well, yeah, and let me explain why. So, for example, in our case, as you know, we have a subject matter application. It specifies three subjects: fiscal restraints on the federal government, term limits on Congress and federal officials, and scope of jurisdictional restraints on the federal government. Let's say we got to the point where the number of Democrat legislatures was the majority. Right now, it's important to note 31 legislatures controlled by Republicans. I believe that will be 32 or 33. Come January, it'll be 34 after Virginia flips, which it will in the next cycle there, an off-year election. So first of all, I mean, it's just we don't have to really worry anytime in the near future about the legislatures being dominated by Democrats. If we did, what would happen is they would begin rescinding our applications. They wouldn't go to convention on this application and we know this because they almost universally vote against us in the legislatures. You've got them lobbying against us, paid lobby groups from the left advocating against us in the legislatures. And you have literally every single left-wing group in the United States of America signed a press release against Convention of States. And so I know I'm not worried about them going to convention on our application. It's just not plausible.
And that's a great response. And so, if you end up being successful, so there are petitions that have, and your language has passed through 19 states now. And of course, the magic constitutional number is 34. So, and we're a lot further ahead than when you and I first talked about this and when I first supported this. And which, congratulations, that's actually really an achievement because that's a lot harder to do than it sounds. But as you would get to a convention on this particular subject matter, and this is where I think your rationale makes sense, because we're not talking about just a wide open free-for-all at a convention that could determine or even propose anything like, for example, rescinding the Second Amendment or the First Amendment, or even amending those amendments. And that's where everyone's fear lies. And so if we had a convention of states just on the three subject matter areas that the Convention of States project is proposing textually, where do you think the Republican-led delegates would then fall on the language that would actually be proposed, and where might some of the pitfalls be?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm going to have to surmise here because we're not there. Only God knows where it actually ends up. But I think what will happen, just based on practical politics, Jenna, is that we're going to get the common sense reforms. And what I mean by that is things that you and I might really want as very serious conservatives. For example, the repeal of the 17th Amendment. I would love to see senators appointed by state legislatures. I don't believe that we have a chance of getting that, as much as I would like it, as important as I think it would be. What we're going to get are the ones that poll very highly across party lines. For example, we're going to get some sort of balanced budget amendment with tax and spending caps. What exactly does that look like? I don't know. And frankly, I don't claim to be smart enough. I'm not an economist. I don't know how to do all the finance. Then we're going to have people at convention, and convention's supposed to be a deliberative body that debate about that and figure it out. We're going to get term limits. 85% of the American people are in favor of some form of term limits on Congress. And we've added federal officials. I think that's critical. In other words, staffers and bureaucrats, what you experienced personally in the deep state, right? Those people,
Yep.
part of the problem they have so much power is because they're there for 30 or 40 years. I think we may be able to do away with federally chartered unions. I think this is a fundamental problem. FDR said they're incompatible with public service. So I think that's another thing we could potentially get out of this. I think we're going to get what's called a single subject amendment. And what that means is that instead of these giant omnibus spending bills, nobody knows what's in them, nobody reads them. Each bill will be required to have a single piece of subject matter in it so that the American people can understand what's in them, and also so that the Congress people who have to vote on them, to be fair, they don't know. And then they get these bills, they're gigantic. They don't have the time to read or understand them, even if they wanted to. So I think we're going to get that. And then on the area of limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, I think there's pretty broad spread agreement on things like people want local authority over education. And so whether that's Democrat or Republican, whether they're in Berkeley, California, or they're in Lubbock, Texas, folks like to control their local education systems. So I'd like to see us do away with things like the Department of Education. I would say the EPA is on the chopping block. Every state has its equivalent of the EPA. I would say taking the power over healthcare away from the federal government. These are areas where the federal government has usurped state power. And I think there's broad support across the country for returning that power to the states.
Yeah, and interestingly, those last few subject areas that you articulated, not only are they still actually in the U.S. Constitution if we followed it, because there isn't power that's even given to the Congress on things, or the executive on a federal level on things like, education policy and healthcare. But for the liberal left who wants to have their design and education system the way that they prefer it, they even are supporting something like that. So you can see how it's bipartisan. And then it would become, though, a state level and state controlled issue, just like, for example, what's happening with abortion in the Dobbs case. I mean, that was a phenomenal decision that did not determine the moral question of abortion, but rather the constitutional question, and said, we need to give this back to the states. I totally agree with you in terms of repealing the 17th Amendment. And I actually talked about that in my opening as well, and said, we need to get back to the way that the framers intended it. But for things that are really reshaping and limiting the power of Congress, this is exactly, as you and I have discussed before, this is exactly why the founders framed Article 5 and allowed for the states to bypass Congress, because we can see on both sides, Democrats and Republicans in Washington, why they would never vote for term limits on themselves. They would never vote out the swamp. You better believe Mitch McConnell would never support that. So all of these things are very important, but obviously don't have support of the Democrats on that level. How much support, other than obviously, the 19 state legislatures that have said yes to this resolution, how much support is there on the state legislatures to send delegates then, if you get to a convention, that would support these types of ideas?
Yeah, I think there's massive support across the board, even in the states, Jenna, where we haven't passed. And to be fair, it's going to be primarily a Republican thing. I think we need 34 states controlled by Republicans who are going to pass this, because it's tribal, though it's not partisan, right? People look at it, and I understand why. If you look at our webpage, you've got me, and clearly a right-wing guy, and Mike Ferris and Sean Hannity and Ben Shapiro. So if you're of the left in any way, shape, or form, you're going to look at that and think, I'm not interested in this. And I get why people feel that way. So it's going to come out of Republican state legislatures. And I travel around. I've been in 48 of them around the country now. There's broad support for the things that we just discussed. I would say the one that is the most limited, which is super interesting to me, not what I expected, is when I go into the state legislatures, they don't like term limits. And I think because you're dealing with legislators, they don't like being term limited. And this might sound funny, but they all think they're going to Washington, D.C., or the vast majority of them. So they picture themselves as the one being term limited in D.C., and they really don't like that. So that's been kind of a rough one. I expected that to be the easiest because my pitch was, look, we need people like you in DC. The only way to do that is term out the long timers there. But they all think they're going to make it to DC. So that's been the toughest hurdle to overcome when talking to state legislators.
Which that makes sense. And, they almost see that as the stepping stone. And unfortunately, if they could experience what you and I have seen in Washington, they may not even want to be part of the corruption.
Exactly.
Like stay on the state level, you can actually get more done. But, as far as with Democrats, you probably saw the headline that Tulsi Gabbard is now has left the Democrat Party, and her family is very prominent in Hawaii. How much do you think that potentially her influence or her voice or someone like her on the Democrat side that isn't so completely progressive leftist could help balance the non-partisanship that is truly the Convention of States project?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful. And I have talked to Tulsi. I have a lot of respect for her. She's a very smart woman. She's a great patriot. A lot of people don't realize it. You see it on her website. If you look at her, she's in active or reserve military service. She spent 4 months earlier this year in North Africa, actually actively serving. So I have a lot of respect for her. We talked about Convention of States a lot. I think it would be very helpful, but she's also been essentially excommunicated by the Democrat Party officially. Now, I think it helps because I think there are a lot of smart, what I would describe as moderate Democrats, old, maybe blue dog style Democrats, who are looking for where to go. What's my home? What do I do now? It's really interesting because you've got the radical left of the party is driving things. But when we start talking about stuff like CRT and gender ideology and forcing people to take vaccines, there are a lot of folks that would consider themselves Democrats and maybe even really left-leaning Democrats. They're not into that kind of stuff, and they're frustrated and they don't have a home. So I think Tulsi gives them an opportunity to look at somebody who's smart and measured, and I would add kind and not an inflammatory person. I mean, she really is a wonderful person to talk to. I think she could be a great leader of this movement away from the radical left.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I told her today I was really proud of her for finally stepping away from the Democrat Party. And, we've seen the extremes, though, on both sides with, a lot of this rejection from true conservatives and people, who loved and supported Donald Trump's policies, regardless of whether they like the mean tweets or not. Yeah. This kind of MAGA movement that is away from the old rhino establishment. That really is part and parcel of what people love about conservatism and the Convention of States project there. And so, we actually do see more of a cohesion among the people who are just Americans and who understand, this isn't the extremes of either party. This isn't about power. It's not, both parties really need each other essentially to survive. And so they're not interested in doing the business of we the people and what we would actually prefer them to do. And so this is where I think the founders, of course, were very brilliant in allowing a Convention of States alternative to completely bypass Washington and say, you guys are totally out of this. We can take control for ourselves and we can determine to impose on you some other outside restraints. So one of the other concerns, though, that I've heard as well is with the judiciary aspect of that. What is to stop a sort of a court packing situation, even among people who are Republicans, who may not like the current composition of the court? I don't think there's a lot of Republicans that are really in favor of adding seats on the Supreme Court, but is that a concern under your petition?
Actually, what I would love to do under our petition have been a lot of suggestions about this. When we first started, it wasn't even something we had to consider, of the idea of actually passing a new amendment limiting the court to 9. This is really interesting, and it's important we look at the language of our application. Everything is couched in terms of limits on the power of the federal government. So right now, the federal government, Congress, has the absolute authority to put as many people on the court as they would like. And, it could be 100 people on the court. And we can limit that power by capping the court at 9 and preventing them from doing that. So I think what we could do is take that chip off the playing field.
Which I think would be an excellent alternative to make this less political, which the Supreme Court should not be as partisan and political and debated as it is, because, of course, in the framework of originalism that you and I subscribe to, we see that very clearly, but it's become so partisan because of the federal branches being able to reach in and to disrupt and appoint and do so many other things. So that's actually a really fascinating kind of alternative that you have on the petition. And so anything else that in the last just few minutes that I have with you here, is there anything else that you think that people should know from the perspective of why Convention of States is important and how they can get involved right now?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you because you were an early adopter. It's a lot easier to get on board now. 19 states have passed. You've got kind of anybody and everybody. We got a huge list of endorsers, but you were in early, and you and I spent a lot of time together. You understood it intellectually. You understood it constitutionally. You understood the history of it. You took the time to dig in and really know. So there is one piece that is my greatest frustration still, and it's this idea that there's going to be a runaway convention. And you mentioned it, maybe they'll repeal the Second Amendment. And so I'll use that as an example because I think that's the best example. I hear that one all the time from what I would describe as otherwise rational conservatives. They say that, and then if you look at the math and you just do the simple math, it takes 38 states to ratify anything. So I don't believe convention can get out of control. There's a lot of reasons for that, but let's assume I'm wrong about all of that, and it does. And let's assume somehow they get 26 states to agree that they should make a suggestion to the rest of the states to pass an amendment to repeal the Second Amendment. You'd have to find 38 states to ratify that. Today, there are 24 states that have constitutional carry, meaning you don't even need a permit to carry your handgun. There are 24 states that allow you to carry your handgun inside a state legislature. And believe it or not, there are 14 states where you could take your AR, put one in the chamber, sling it across your back, and sit in the gallery and watch the proceedings. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm just saying that's the law in 14 states. And so the idea that you couldn't find 13 states who would be opposed to the repeal of the Second Amendment is just ridiculous. And so if you do the math, and I'll put this out to your viewers, I do with everybody, my personal email address is mmeckler@cosaction.com. If you can think of an amendment that you or I as conservatives wouldn't like, just write it down in layman's language and give it to me and show me the 38 states that'll ratify it. Jenna, I've been making that offer literally for 9 years now. I've been on Newsmax with you. I've made the offer there. I've done it on Hannity and Shapiro and everywhere else, millions of people. I've received exactly 0 emails that can fulfill that criteria because it's not possible. Anything you or I wouldn't like, even if it could come out of convention, which it can't, it would not be ratified. There's just a 0% chance of ratification. And that brings us all the way back to the very beginning, which is it's not human nature I trust. It's not people that I trust because I understand the wisdom of the founders. It's the structure that the founders put in place and the framers put in place. And I think if we don't trust that anymore, then we've lost our country.
Yeah, very well said. And, it's the exact same reason that we see so many bad ideas that are proposed every day in Congress with the Democrats, but you can't even get it through the majority of the Congress that we do have that's currently under Democrat control. And so, your example there of how many states it would actually take goes all the way back to what I was talking about in the very beginning with Justice Scalia saying, the founders didn't even know what an excess of legislation was, but they made it hard on purpose to pass laws and to create laws. And they made it even harder to pass constitutional amendments, and that's for a reason and for a purpose. And so in that sense, we do have the ultimate safeguard. So Mark, I really appreciate it so much. And, I was an early supporter just because I was very blessed to know you, and also Mike Ferris, who I understand is coming back since he has stepped down as the CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, is actually coming back to work with Convention of States. So tell me a little bit about that too, because I love you both dearly. You've been mentors and great friends to me. So that's really exciting to hear as well, because he was one of the first that walked me through kind of step by step the constitutional analysis.
Yeah, I know he's mentored both of us, and he's one of the most amazing human beings in modern American history. Founder of HSLDA, founder of Patrick Henry College, one of the founders of Convention of States, now outgoing CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, the largest religious liberties organization in the world. Really an amazing man. I don't know if you know their stats. It's incredible. 14 cases at the Supreme Court since he's been there. They've won 13 of them. So he's really made a mark preserving religious liberty. So he decided it was time to have a younger CEO step up. He had a great person in place. So she's coming in at the end of the year. Mike's going to be coming back to us working part-time. We announced this at our summit in Orlando just 2 days ago. And I'll tell you, Jenna, it just makes me emotional to say it. He was overwhelmed because people just flocked to him. And he said literally over 1,000 times people welcomed him home. We awarded him a Lifetime Achievement Award, which was the Tom Coburn George Mason Lifetime Achievement Award. It was really emotional. He is not only a great man, but he's a personal mentor to me and like a brother to me. And so having him back and being able to work with him again, I couldn't be happier or more optimistic.
That's awesome. Well, the band is back together, and I'm so glad that that he was able to receive that award. And he is just one of the most amazing human beings and mentors. And I consider him a father figure. And for those watching, if you haven't read my book, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, actually end with an argument for the Convention of States project, talking about the history and the Christian foundation of the Constitution. And Mike Ferris was very, very kind, and I think one of probably the highest honors of my legal career was that he was willing to write the foreword to that book. So he's incredible, and so glad that you did get the band back together, and looking forward to great things. So Mark Meckler, where can people find Convention of State Project and get involved?
Just go to conventionofstates.com, and everything's there. All these arguments we're talking about are all there. And then there's also, if you want to get involved, you can sign the petition. You can click the Take Action tab and volunteer. The last thing I want to say, Jenna, is for those who are watching you, I actually think the most important thing about you is you're willing to actually be in the fight. So there are a lot of folks out there who are talking heads, and they talk about a lot of stuff, and they make people angry, and everybody gets frustrated watching the shows. You're actually a warrior in the fight, and I think that sets you apart, and I really appreciate you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And, I'm just kind of taken your and Mike's lead on that, and have modeled after you both. So thanks so much, Mark. And your friendship is really dear and important to me. And so I really appreciate you taking the time. And it's been too long, and hope to see you on Newsmax again soon.
Absolutely. God bless you, Jenna. Thanks.
God bless you too. Thanks.
I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks were willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.